Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine war update extra, giving you the extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I'm going to go to a comment by Defective over, at one of my previous videos. And this is where is a news video I did 2 days ago. And I mentioned how Lula, the Brazilian president, have been possibly misquoted uh, to suggest that he thought that Crimea could be on the table for negotiations, uh, and that Ukraine should be negotiating with Russia and that kind of thing. And I said, well, this appears to be a misinterpretation, a cherry picking of what he actually said. And I just talking about him, and I was like, okay, maybe a little bit going to be more in favor of Lula than Bolsonaro because of my own political positioning, and so that might make me try and look more favorably on Lula than I would have done with Bolsonaro, who was previously in charge of Brazil. Anyway, the point is that it's really easy to be quite morally adamant about where people might sit in their support for Ukraine, and to say, oh, this person's not supporting Ukraine obviously enough or explicitly enough. So someone like Lula and Brazil, what you've got to remember is that they have their entire political history and their country's needs to take into account in ways that we won't necessarily understand. So the first thing to remember is that Brazil is part of BRICS, which is a bunch of countries that are getting together to present an alternative hegemony to the US based, I'd say system, but situation. So the US is like top of the pile, and the international trade currency for trade is the US dollar, and this group of countries wants to present an alternative to that, and Brazil is part of that. And Lula is now the president of Brazil, and he's in a situation where they are supposed to be nurturing closer ties with Russia. BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So here he is having to do that, and there's a war going on. And he obviously doesn't want the war going on, but you've got to understand that there are other things also happening under the hood, if you like, under the bonnet. Now, Defective talks to this and does it very well. He says the Brazilian government's perspective is simple. They need Russia not to crumble, and they need the US secured global trade system to continue. So although Brazil have actually gone against BRICS and gone to Argentina and said perhaps we should introduce our own currency across kind of a bilateral currency between Argentina and Brazil so we can trade internationally with each other, which is interesting because that's kind of positioning themselves against BRICS, saying, well, actually, we don't want to do a BRICS currency. We can do our own little bilateral currency here. So that was interesting. That's happened over the last few months. But then you've got this as Defective. Sorry, I've interrupted Defective's comment here. So they need Russia not to crumble, and they need the US secured global trade system to continue. Without both of these things, Brazil is in huge trouble. So once you understand that, then you understand how Brazil is reacting to the war in Ukraine. Now, Russia is and I talked about this previously when I did a video on BRICS and specifically Brazil, and talked about their fertilizer industry and how they have a very close relationship with Russia in terms of exports and imports. So Russia is a primary supplier of specific Brazilian strategic imports, most notably fertilizer. Brazil is wholly reliant upon global free trade and those large imports. Without either, Brazil would struggle to remain a global economic player. They can't anger Russia if they want to get back access to their cost competitive imports that they have managed to secure via BRICS agreements. They also can't live in a world where the US remains powerful enough to interdict trade with its navy should the global trade system fracture in two as the PRC wants, as China wants. The only solution to the Ukrainian war that benefit Brazil are total strategic victory by Russia and its PRC backers, seeing those two nations totally supplant the US, or a return to the pre-war status quo. A Russian defeat hurts Brazil. A US PRC proxy war hurts Brazil, and a Russian Pyrrhic victory that puts Russia entirely in the Chinese pocket and leads to a global trade split also hurts Brazil. Really, really interesting comment here, and I thank him for this a lot. We need to understand, not everyone, and perhaps no one, other than unconnected people like us as third-party observers, no one in the geopolitical world is looking at the Ukraine war from a purely moral point of view. So we can sit here and say the Russians are terrible, they're committing war crimes, we want Ukraine to win. America, you need to give all this stuff to Ukraine. EU, you need to give all this stuff to Ukraine. Our own countries, you need to give all this stuff to Ukraine, right? And we look at this from because we want Ukraine to win, because we've had an aggressor invade this sovereign, self-determining nation, and that's morally bad, and we want to rectify that moral wrongness. So we look at it like that, and that's arguably quite simplistic, but it's idealistic, and that's how, as a kind of neutral, scare quotes, neutral observer is going to look at that. Countries are going to look at the war, and they will have a moral reaction to that, but then they'll also be considering everything else that they as a country need to consider, which is the welfare of their own population, which is connected to the economic performance of their country, which is going to be connected to imports and exports, which is going to be connected to the amount of money they're spending on defense, how much help they can possibly give to Ukraine without causing problems later down the line, etc., etc., etc. And so the moral calculation is kind of swamped by all these other calculations, which themselves might have a moral dimension, but there'll be a moral dimension that will be concerning their own populations as opposed to what's going on in Ukraine to the people in Ukraine. And so understanding how Lula, for example, might be positioning himself and Brazil in terms of the war in Ukraine, sadly, and this is the same for arguably everyone, isn't just going to be about whether he sees what Russia is doing as wrong, right or wrong, and what Ukraine are doing as right or wrong, or whatever. It's not going to be about that. It's going to be, okay, shit's hit the fan, and if it goes that way, that's bad for us, and if it goes that way, that's bad for us, and we kind of want it to stay the same, or a complete victory one way rather than the other. And so then you start understanding why he says what he says. It's easy to castigate people for not being morally idealistic, but the world is nuanced, and people have geopolitical considerations to concern themselves with. It would be lovely if everyone was reacting to this war from a purely moral point of view, because you would get a universal. Like, there's no way that actually, if you took the Ukraine war and the Russia and you took that idea and abstracted it to an alien world, right? And you asked China, so what would you think if that entity invaded that entity in the planet Zob, right? And you'd probably say China would probably morally agree with where I see this, which is these guys are the aggressors, they're doing the moral bad, and Ukraine are the victims here. Why doesn't the whole world evaluate this in the same way that I do, or you do, or whatever? Is because everyone else has got their own baggage that they're bringing to that, and their baggage is their own country and what happens if Russia win or Russia loses in terms of their own country, and how they view the world, and whether they see the US hegemony as a good or bad thing, so on and so forth. And so once you start understanding what everyone stands to win or lose as a nation in terms of this war, and geopolitically, then you start understanding why people are reacting in the way that they do. Yeah, I suppose it's a call for nuance, or at least understanding. That's not justification. Explanation is not justification. I'm not justifying like Brazil's answer here, or China's answer here. I'm saying once we understand where they're coming from, that explains why they react in the way that they do. And we're never going to undo or change people's opinions until we understand why they hold those opinions or those views. Understanding breeds a greater ability to affect change. Right. Okay. Trentelenko, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense certainly has established the world standard in trolling Russians. Now, I find this quite fascinating. This is a video, and sadly, I will get copyright infringement if I play it, but play it with sound. But you need it with sound because it kind of gives you the sense of well, it's that multimodal appreciation of a piece of media here. Now, this is PR. And what's interesting here is they are advertising a freaking counter-offensive. Right? The Ukrainians have put together a video that's almost the same as like announcing the next U2 tour, right? They're using the U2 song here, and you watch this and you get a feeling of growing like anticipation and excitement, and then you catch yourself saying, "Hang on, this is a war," and this is a PR video for an offensive, for a counter-offensive. It's insane. But that is the level that Ukraine are operating in the information space and succeeding in a way that Russia aren't. I think Russia are failing to win the hearts and minds in terms of doing stuff like this. I just think it's fascinating. Go and watch it. I'll play it, but sadly without the music. But so it says through. So let's go from the beginning. Through mud and forest, it cuts in, and a guy, a Ukrainian soldier walking through a muddy trench, through fields and trenches. Ukrainian soldiers together. Look at that togetherness. This is the sense of together. Our soldiers have traveled the world. Sunlight beaming through these soldiers in slow motion walking to train. So these guys are training with the help of others, training on Challenger, UK training there. What it takes other armies months to learn, and then it's showing training again. They have learned in weeks, and actually, you've got here. I'm going to play this guy because you actually hear him. This is a UK instructor.
And here we are 1 month after these guys have shown up, and they're doing fire and maneuver exercises.
So it's saying after 1 month, they're already doing this stuff that would take our guys normally heaps longer. And those are challenges on Salisbury Plain. And it says, sorry, I'm just going to go back. It says they now command tanks, beautiful imagery, beautiful sunshine, infantry fighting vehicles. And that's the PR stunt with Reznikov, and air defense systems. And it's showing all this kit for what? Question mark. You'll see. And then spring, hashtag spring is coming. So this is like winter is coming. This is like Game of Thrones. This is getting people excited. Oh, you'll see, building up that tension. And it's a war. They are PR stunting the war. They are creating slick PR for a war. Now, I just find that really interesting. And kind of good, but I also feel a bit weird about that, evidently, because this is all about, taking back territory, which is a good thing, but it will necessarily involve the death of many people, including many of their own soldiers. Just, yeah, how. But then I guess if you go and look at the Pathé news pieces, propaganda that comes out the Second World War, where it's like instead of U2, you've got brass band music and stuff. It's actually no different. Arguably, the reels that were coming back from the front line in World War II that were like showing how wonderful things were, when they were doing the kind of propaganda ones. It really is no different. You were sitting in a cinema watching that and feeling good about the British Army or American Army or whatever operating in whatever theatre. Here, you're sitting and watching this on a laptop at home or on your phone on the metro to work, and you're feeling good about the Ukrainian chances there and the Ukrainian project, and that's it succeeding in doing its job. Okay, Mick Ryan, Australian general. This week, there have been at least 2 purported intelligence leaks reported by the New York Times and other publications. While we are at an early point, I want to provide a short update on some of the likely impacts. The first leak was mainly focused on the war in Ukraine and was composed of photographs of PowerPoint slides from a US military briefing. At least some of the images appeared to have been tampered with before they were posted online. The subsequent set of documents was uploaded onto social media sites. These documents apparently concern issues including information on allies and close US security partners. Leaks such as these can expose sensitive collection capabilities as well as impending plans and strategies prior to their execution. At their worst, they can cost the lives of intelligence operatives and soldiers on military operations. At this stage, it is difficult to assess the accuracy of the leaked documents, the veracity of the information they appear to contain, or the purpose for which they were leaked. However, there are 5 key impacts. First, every intelligence agency in every nation mentioned in the documents is probably already well into a damage assessment activity. This is a massively time-consuming activity, and it is something that can be tasked to computer algorithms, as is not something that can be tasked to computer algorithms or something like ChatGPT. Humans will be needed in large numbers to undertake these risk assessments and to develop mitigation plans. A second impact is that this will be hugely distracting to intelligence agencies, particularly at a time when these agencies are overtasked and overworked in supporting Ukrainian operations, as well as preparation for future conflicts in places such as Indo-Pacific. There will be a large opportunity cost for the time spent in risk assessments and implementing mitigation plans. Intelligence operatives in Beijing and Moscow will not only be hugely entertained, but who will be finding ways to make the leaks hurt Ukraine and the US. It's an interesting point that there will be opportunistic players on the world geopolitical stage, such as China, that will be either directly um, benefiting from these leaks, as in they're finding out about US movements or aspirations for the Indo-Pacific, and so that intelligence is explicitly useful for them in it for their own benefit there, or kind of passively useful for them or indirectly useful for them, because when the US gets screwed over or their allies or NATO gets screwed over, then anyone who's not in that group kind of arguably might stand to gain. And China might be looking over at this thinking, okay, how can we make use of this? And this is great because we can sit back and eat the popcorn. And this is harming them, which is, in this kind of zero-sum game approach to the world, possibly benefiting us. A harm to them is a benefit to us, so on and so forth. A third impact is trust. It has taken some time, and there is an obvious level of deep trust between the US and Ukrainian officials that will now be stained by these leaks. Before the leaks, there was a significant amount of sharing of information and not just intelligence, data on weapons and munitions stock holdings, as well as where Ukraine was using or deploying donated weapons was being shared. With these leaks, there will be some who will be tempted on both sides to pull back from such openness. This would not only hinder Ukraine's war effort, but would aid Russia. Hopefully, cool heads will prevail. I expect they will. A fourth impact is that this has provided Russia and China with a massive gift in their war of influence with the United States and other democracies. So this is like the explicit gain I was talking about. The US will again be accused of spying on its allies and not being trustworthy with the sensitive information. This is actually a significant impact and something that US diplomats are undoubtedly already speaking to their foreign partners about. China and Russia will want to use the leaks to continue their efforts to corrode America's security relationships and alliances. In China's case, these leaks provide a very useful distraction from their enhanced campaign of intimidation against Taiwan being undertaken in the wake of the Taiwanese president's visit to the United States. A final impact is the trust that individuals place in the information they've received. It has become difficult for many of our citizens and even our military to ascertain the difference between truth and fiction. As one Ukrainian military officer stated this week in the New York Times article, quote, "We can no longer determine where is the truth and where is the lie. This is a corrosive trend for democracies. It is disastrous for military institutions in the middle of a fight for survival." There may well be more leaks in the coming days, and we are likely to learn more about the accuracy of the information contained in the leaks. We might even at some point learn who was responsible. Regardless, the leaking of these documents has already had a major impact on trust and relationships. It is a dream come true for Putin and Xi, and the leaks are a nightmare for Biden, Stoltenberg, Zelensky, and the soldiers seeking to hold the line in the defense of Ukraine. They deserve better. It's going to be really interesting as to whether they find out where these leaks came from, and what the ramifications are in the medium to long term of these leaks. It is unsurprisingly taking up a lot of news at the moment, because this, I think, has very real impact on those kind of relationships that Ryan was talking about there. Right. Moving on to Samuel Bendett, sorry, who is a bit of an expert on uncrewed autonomous and robotic military systems and artificial intelligence, so on and so forth. He says multiple Russian Telegram channels are posting an apparent summary of a Ukrainian analysis of how Russian military uses the Lancet loitering drones. Among supposed Lancet strengths is a modern guidance system and use against moving objects at a distance of up to 60 kilometers. Other strengths include Lancet's small size, relative quietness, and composite construction that makes them extremely difficult targets for radar detection. What that means is if they're made out of predominantly plastic and not very many bits of metal, and this is the strength of the Australian cardboard drones, is that they are very difficult to detect by radar, and therefore you can't jam them as easily. You don't know they're coming, and so on and so forth. So the Ukrainian analysis of the Lancet drones, he goes on to talk about, says of their weakness, a low flight speed of up to 100 kilometers per hour and a small warhead that is ineffective against armored targets. And I've shown you plenty of Lancet drones that have done minimal damage or no damage to that which they have hit. If they're heavily armored, sometimes they effectively just sort of bounce off. Moreover, Lancet's 34-minute flight time was recognized as sufficient to support Russian ground units at the tactical level. However, the Ukrainian command believes that at the moment Lancets are used only by the special forces and mobile recon groups, which limits the overall Russian forces' infantry capabilities. So where previously the Russians have had embedded their kind of all-land drones, the less high-tech, longer traveling reconnaissance drones, and they're embedded within units, and that gives them capability to do ISR, sort of surveillance and reconnaissance, intelligence surveillance reconnaissance of enemy troops and whatnot. These Lancers seem to not be embedded across the Russian military units, but just within special forces. The most dangerous Lancet use is during the night, from 11 o'clock at night to 6 in the morning, due to the difficulty in visual identification and determining the exact Lancet numbers during the attack. Russians record that Ukrainian military notes. The Ukrainian military notes that Lancets are usually used with the Orlan 10 30 Recon UAVs, goodness me, and with the Mohajer 4 and Mohajer 6 Iranian Recon strike drones, which Russians think is strange considering that Zala ISR drones are usually used in pairs with Lancets. So I need to kind of sit and work that out on it. So Russians record that Ukrainian military notes that Lancers are usually used with the Orlan 10 and 30 Recon drones, and with Mohajer 4 and 6 Iranian drones. And they think that's odd because actually Zala are used with Lancers. So they think that the Ukrainians have got that wrong about how these are used. Anyway, there's a little insight into Samuel Bendett's or what the Russians think of the Ukrainians thinking of the Russian drones, if you get my meaning. So we're going to go back to Samuel Bendett now. So Mick Ryan says, here's another great thread from autonomous systems expert Samuel Bendett on the proliferation of battlefield drones in Ukraine and Russian assessments on the widespread use of different drones. So Bendett says, this is a thread on where the Russian forces stand on quadcopters and first-person drones. So quadcopters are with 4 rotor blades, and usually they have a camera pointing down. FPVs can be quadcopters, but they have your camera pointing forward, and often are racing drones that are much harder to detect. They're a lot quicker. Anyway, how to deal with such threats and the way forward, if any, from a pro-Kremlin Telegram channel. Main points below. He says, at the beginning of the war, we were curious to hear that the ranks of the Ukraine armed forces, even in the most separate anti-tank artillery battalions, there were full-time UAV operators with full-time reconnaissance drones. While the vile-looking experts were spewing paid nonsense from Russian TV, the adversary was the adversary was introducing advanced experience with using drones at the systemic level. And February March 2022 was an unpleasant surprise for our troops, largely due to reconnaissance drones. We had to urgently catch up with the adversary, mostly at the expense of volunteers, regular people, and patrons. Our gunners and scouts quickly assessed the effectiveness of this new technology. Later, losses in manpower and equipment were the result of the massive use of drones by the enemy. Demand gave birth to supply and on Chinese marketplaces, and now the Mavic toy is massively ordered by the enemy from these sources. Our troops are also supplied both with such quadcopters and with DIY drones printed by volunteers on 3D printers. In recent months, enemy FPV drones have been causing trouble. Our fighters are both tired of and horrified by them. Interesting. So I refer you back to the Guardian article I dipped into for the news piece this morning, talking about how the Russians are starting to get a handle on jamming the Mavic drones, the DJI drones, the Chinese ones that the Ukrainians use a lot of, and indeed the Russians are using a lot of them as well. But if they're able, the Russians are able to effectively neutralize that threat, then that is a big problem for the Ukrainians, especially as they have shed loads of them, it appears. In some cases, regular electronic warfare saves against FPVs. In others, well-aimed shooting from rifles and standard weapons. In one case, our fighters went to a local village, took a fishing net, and pulled it around their positions. 3 FPV drones were caught in this net. In addition, large agricultural drones operate throughout the front. They can lift a lot of weight and pose a real threat to ground vehicles and systems. And reconnaissance drones have acquired good optics and can accurately adjust enemy artillery. There are no extraordinary reasons for such a massive spread of drones and their technical progress by Ukrainians. It's just that the Ukrainian state has long ago organized and created the conditions for drone production and purchases. So this is kind of the idea that the Ukrainians have doctrinally embedded the use of drones at a faster rate than the Russians have, as according to these Russians. There were claims right throughout the war that the Russians have a better use of, say, the Orlan 10, Orlan 30, that kind of low-tech, long-distance drone that's really good for reconnaissance is really, really effective, and the Russians use that kind of drone better than the Ukrainians. But actually, the Ukrainians have embedded and used these much shorter range, much more highly proliferated drone much more effectively, and it's this idea of combined arms warfare, using them with artillery, using them as artillery, I guess, using them in ISI, in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, so on and so forth. So it continues. Not only have all Ukrainian law enforcement agencies since 2014 taken measures to train drone operators and their full-time introduction into the force structure, but since the beginning of the war, their Ministry of Civil Affairs has launched the Army of Drones project. So this is the United 24 that's raised $310 million. It helped their remove customs duties and restrictions on the import of drones and their components, hence the monstrous Decepticon drones at the front made from plumbing pipes and 8 propellers. How things, I know nothing about that. How things are at Russian customs and among legislators is clear. Recently, in an interview with the Govorit Moskva radio station, a Duma member, so parliament member in Russia, explained the need to control the import of quadcopters and drones, since he was surprised in March 2023, a year after the invasion, that drones can perform not only surveillance and reconnaissance functions, but can also be a source of danger because they can be kamikaze drones and can carry charges, even small grenades. So this is the issue, that there are certain Russian parliament members saying we need to regulate the import of such drones because they could be a threat within Russia. In the coming spring-summer period, the adversary will use a lot of drones in Marinka, Vuhledar, Zaporizhia, and Kherson directions. Forces constantly report the Ukrainian drones are already causing a lot of trouble. Quadcopter and FPV drones from volunteers and patrons are delivered to the front, along with military Lancets and Garans, Shahed 136. But this is not enough. We need to think about it. Several key takeaways from this commentary, says Bendit himself, now going back to not quoting. Another public critique of official state TV that misrepresented Russian situation in Ukraine, and a critique of Russian legislature, which is behind in understanding and managing the evolution of drone threat in Ukraine. Another takeaway in the continued support is the continued support by volunteers that remain the main source of small UAVs, quadros, and FPVs delivered to the front. So this is the idea that the Russian army aren't procuring these drones, that the drones that do get to the front, these commercial off-the-shelf drones or COTS drones, are the result of third parties, patrons, general public, families doing fundraising and getting these drones sent to the front. It's not, there's no cohesive approach by the Russian military. And the points are made are not necessarily new to those who follow the war, but can be new to first-time readers in Russia proper. The Ukrainian FPVs are probably the single most important threat currently to the Russian forces, along with better coordination between the Ukrainian government, military, volunteers, and soldiers. Re the protection from FPV drones. This Russian Telegram post lists the fishing and similar nets that may help against free-falling grenades and metal nets that can withstand an impact from a medium-sized kamikaze drone. It notes that ideally this should be a multi-layer structure with a distance of 10 centimeters or more between layers. The best weaving is chainmail used to protect from rock falls, but in practice the chain link nets also work well. The main thing is to have something to dampen the blow. We have to ask if this public data about tactics and technologies is in fact legit. Why should so many Russian Telegram channels continue to expose so many flaws? Probably because MOD's upper echelons are still foggy about new threats and their evolution. Interesting thread there, I think, from Bender, and we are well within the realms of recognizing that drones are one of the biggest components of this war, and autonomous systems going forward will be a massive component of any future war, I am sure. Right, talking about drones here. Thomas C. Tyner, many of you donated to my friend Natalia's drive to collect money for surveillance drones for Ukrainian troops in Mariinka. The drones have arrived and are now 24/7 in the air to find Russians and quickly welcome them with a few 155mm rounds. So these are spotting drones. Just an interesting bit of footage on Mariinka here, so worth having a little look at. So we will. And you can see just the absolute destruction of Mariinka. And Bakhmut is looking like it's going this way. Avdiivka is looking like it's going this way. And sadly, that is the outcome of war. Here is a drone doing some, I presume, some spotting, trying to find targets. There's been reporting from Ukraine talked about how the Ukrainians have managed to take out some snipers, Russian snipers in the Bakhmut area, and I presume drones will be useful in doing that kind of activity as well. Just incredible how destroyed Mariinka is here. As you can see, the quality of the footage, the high definition footage you get back from these drones these days, he says that it goes blurry. It is quite incredible, and it allows the people operating them and using them to have that much more information. So there you go. More footage as well. There is a tank, I presume, in Mariinka that gets taken out. Suicide drones to blow up Russian vehicles. They're raising money for this. This is going back to what was previously said. So although there is this cohesive approach of the Ukrainians with their army, with their Ministry of Defense, with their government in terms of providing drones across the theatre and to all these different units, and we've got these drone battalions, being drone brigades or whatever they are, being created in advance of the counteroffensive. They still do rely on an awful lot of volunteers and patrons raising money to get drones even quicker to the front line. So, and that includes in this case, drones that get used as suicide drones, ISR drones, all sorts. Natalia wishes to everyone a happy, wonderful Easter, and thank you for getting all these drones that allow them to do war. So anyway, yeah, drones. It's super important for executing a successful war, I guess. Okay, the last thing I want to say is it's just an answer to like pro-Russian voices, people in the threads that you come across, but people out there that you maybe talk to. I was talking to a helicopter pilot friend of mine yesterday who was formerly in the armed forces, flown in Afghanistan, etc., etc. And he was asking me, "What do you think about this?" Like giving like the Russian talking points. It's like he's obviously thought about these things or seen things that have been said in places, and then come to me and said, and I just put down all those Russian talking points. So I was like, "Well, that's wrong. That's wrong. That's wrong for this reason. And wrong for that reason." He's like, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah." But there's someone you'd expect to have a really staunchly pro-Ukrainian view, having quite a nuanced view and taking on board some of the Russian talking points, and it shows you how effective the Russians have been in spreading some of these really problematic views that can be easily shut down if you know how to shut them down. The point of me saying stuff like this isn't just to answer people in the threads below, right? It's to answer to talk to your friends, and your friends may be really knowledgeable, but just be skewed one way as a result of X, Y, and Z. Or this is to, answer just outright claims from politicians or whatever. But when you have people who are either pro-Russian because they're Russian or pro-Russian because they just support the Russians and against the Americans, the question I want to ask someone, say a pro-Russian voice in my thread, is how are Russians themselves going to select themselves their next president? How are they going to select their leader? Only because what Ukraine are fighting for here are democratic values, fighting for the building up of their democratic institutions and mechanisms of transparency, wanting to join the EU, because the EU, and there will be people who like to slag off the EU, but if you look at the whole world, they are actually a bastion of democracy compared to an awful lot of stuff out there. And I can sit here and be hypercritical of the American UK political system, right? Where in the US you've got lobbying, which is legalized corruption, where like 100% of one party is paid by the NRA, like receives 100% of them receive of the lawmakers receive money from a lobbying institution that will skew their voting. That they've got first past the post. The UK has first past the post, which is the least democratic system of all the democratic systems. In America, it's a two-party first past the post system. It's the narrowest form of democracy that you can possibly get. And you've got the electoral college system in America, which is really problematic and unrepresentative for a whole bunch of ways. And you've got senators coming from states that have wildly different populations, but they have the same representation, and so on and so forth. And yet still, that American system, and still the UK system that has similar flaws, is vastly better than what Russia has, which is an effective dictatorship. So when you come onto my threads and say, "Oh, this about and attacking Ukraine Nazis and all this stuff," how are you choosing your next leader? How are you choosing the leader of your country? Because if you ain't choosing them, you can jog on. You can jog on with your criticisms of what Ukraine is trying to do. Because Ukraine is trying to set up a country where they have self-determination, where each of those people are represented politically, that they are being governed by people who are selected fairly by the people of that country. They are fighting for that. They're giving their lives up for that. How are you, Russia, selecting your next leader? How are you, Russians, selecting your next leader? Because it looks to me like all those checks and balances, all those democratic checks and balances have been removed. All those institutions have been tampered with such that you have no effective democracy. You have the threat that Ukraine poses to Russia is that the Russians can see that it has a form of succession. And that succession would, if that country wasn't invaded and was operating as it should be operating, sees one government be replaced by another government when it is voted out, or maintains if it is voted back in. That the system isn't rigged such that Putin will rule again and again and then come back again as from president to prime minister to president, changes things, and is an oligarch, is an oligarchic ruler who's one of the richest, if not is the richest human being on earth, who has family members that suddenly got billions of dollars for doing what? Oh, for being connected to Putin. And it's all about the money and the power. Okay, where are the democratic values in that country? So if you're either Russian yourself and on my thread being paid to do your bot activity by the Kremlin, how are you voting for your next leader? How are you selecting your next president? Because when you slag off the quote, scare quote, nucro-Nazis, these are people giving up their lives for democratic freedom, for liberty, for the rule of law, and for the ability to vote freely and fairly.